A week ago, the lives of Ukrainians were turned upside down when they woke up to this. Many had feared a lightning-fast advance by Russian troops, expecting Kiev to fall within days. But that did not happen, as Ukrainians mounted a robust resistance. Was this a massive miscalculation, or does Putin still have a plan? I'm Jafar Hasnan, and today's newsmaker is Russia's military strategy. If Putin's plan was to rapidly take over Kiev and install a puppet regime, it hasn't quite worked out that way. The resilience of the Ukrainians has likely exceeded the Kremlin's expectations, and much to the world's surprise, Russia's military strategy has appeared sketchy at best. So far, Russia has failed to establish air dominance. Not only is the Ukrainian Air Force still active, it is now better armed with fresh infusions of missiles and drones from friendly countries. Russian tanks are being systematically destroyed. Many have been seen stranded on Ukrainian highways, out of fuel and often abandoned. Social media is full of images of Ukrainian civilians blocking the path of Russian tanks. Ukraine's defense ministry has shared instructional videos on how to make and launch Molotov cocktails at Russian tanks. Ukrainian women, young and old, have been pitching in wherever they can. Some have taken up arms to fight. Others have been weaving camouflage nets for Ukrainian troops.
Ми народ, який за тиждень зламав плани ворога.
We are the people who in a week have destroyed the plans of the enemy, plans made for years, dishonorably, premeditatively, with hatred toward our country and our people, to all people who have two things, freedom and a heart. But we stopped them. We are beating them off. Our soldiers, our border guards, our militias, even ordinary farmers are capturing Russian soldiers daily, and they all say the same. They don't know why they're here. Though they are 10 times more in number, the morale of the enemy is falling. Increasing numbers of occupants are running back to Russia. From us. From you.
Now, by any standard, the military hardware flowing into Ukraine from donor countries has been unprecedented. Plane loads of anti-tank and surface-to-air missiles, as well as guns, bullets, and heavy artillery ammunition have been coming in to Kiev from the US, UK, EU, Canada, and Nordic countries. Many of these countries, including the UK, have also provided operational training. The Javelin and NLAW anti-tank missiles have been critical in halting the advance of the Russian army. Burnt-out Russian tanks scattered across Ukrainian highways are evidence of how effective these weapons are. A major factor in keeping the Russians from establishing air dominance has been the ground-to-air Stinger missiles. The Ukrainian government claims they have shot down several Russian fighter jets and helicopters using these weapons. Nevertheless, Russia's assault continues. 1 week on, this is how the map looks like. Russia has made its largest advance in the east of the country. That is where the separatist-run Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics are. Russia appears to have seized the Black Sea port of Kherson, that is close to Crimea, which Russia annexed in 2014. Mariupol has reportedly been surrounded, and the governor says the city has lost electricity and water. The country's second-largest city of Kharkiv in the northeast was one of the first to come under attack. And the capital, Kiev, has been shelled repeatedly, while a massive convoy of Russian military vehicles lies north of the city. Now, it is impossible to verify numbers, but the estimates of casualties vary depending on the source. According to Russian state media RT, which has now been banned in Europe, around 500 Russian soldiers have been killed during the assault. And Russia claims to have killed more than 2,800 Ukrainian soldiers. But Ukrainian officials say they have killed around 9,000 Russian troops. They do not mention their own military deaths, but have acknowledged around 400 civilians have been killed. Meanwhile, the UN says there have been more than 750 civilian casualties, and more than 1 million Ukrainians have fled to neighboring countries in just 1 week. Russia's foreign minister has been asked directly about whether the losses they have suffered means things have gone wrong for Putin. Here is how he responded.
Субъективный взгляд.
It's a subjective view. Losses take place. Losses always occur in such situations. I noted this already. As for the question that everything went wrong, I don't think that you are familiar with plans which are not open to the public and which are the basis of the group of our actions carrying out the special military operation by the order of the President.
Well, that military operation was condemned by the United Nations this week when they passed a rare but non-binding resolution demanding that Russia withdraw its military forces. The UN chief warns a new phase of conflict could be far more brutal.
The message of the General Assembly is loud and clear. End hostilities in Ukraine now. Silence the guns now. Open the door to dialogue and diplomacy now. The territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine must be respected in line with the UN Charter. We don't have a moment to lose. The brutal effects of the conflict are plain to see. But as bad as the situation is for the people in Ukraine right now, it threatens to get much, much worse. The ticking clock is a time bomb.
And joining me now from Berlin is Gustav Gressel. He is a senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. David Des Roches joins us from Washington, D.C. He is a professor at the National Defense University. And in Cardiff is Paul Moorcraft, a former officer at the UK Ministry of Defence. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us here on the Newsmakers today. David, as I understand, when President Putin announced this military offensive against Ukraine, one of the primary objectives of the Russians was to maintain Russia's control over the separatist regions of Donetsk and Luhansk. But as part of this offensive, we are seeing Russian attacks as far west as Lviv. So what kind of military strategy is Russia applying in Ukraine?
Well, good question. I think the initial plan was that they were just going to decapitate the Ukrainian regime and replace it with a regime that was basically a vassal state, as are its two puppets in Donetsk and Luhansk. I think that once that strategy was shown to be impractical, I think that they still are aiming for regime change. But now pride is involved, and they're basically trying to escalate this, create a sense of inevitability, and they'll rule Ukraine whether it's functioning or whether it's in ruins.
Okay, Gustav, let me come to you. Now, Russia is a country which is known for its air superiority. For example, we have seen how Russia's air superiority is in countries like Syria, right? But we're not witnessing Russia's air dominance in Ukraine. Why is that?
Oh, first of all, a complete miscalculation and bad operative plans. Everybody in the West or military watcher thought that there would be an initial phase where they want to achieve air superiority. And we saw on the first day that they sort of started to invade on the ground, that they start very fast, deep air assault operations without actually securing or checking up whether they had a secured air dominance in the first few hours of the war. They haven't checked up on these air bases they struck with missiles. The Ukrainians were seemingly clever enough to hide and disperse their assets. And we saw engagement of surface-to-air missiles actually last night, and major ones, not manpads, but S-300s. We saw air combat over Kiev for several days. There's still some unconfirmed reports of Ukrainian aerial action, and this is truly astonishing. So the first reason is, of course, sloppiness and wishful thinking in military planning. But we also need to draw some deep questions about Russia's ability in terms of intelligence, C4ISR, to really get a proper picture of what they are doing and what they are missing in this war.
Okay, Paul, but is this really poor planning or perhaps a part of Russia's strategy. For example, Paul, we are seeing footages emerging from Ukraine showing Russian tanks abandoned by Russian forces. What do you think Russia is trying to do here? Is that really poor planning or perhaps a strategy by the Russians to deceive the Ukrainians?
I think that the Russians have made a lot of mistakes strategically and tactically, that the Air Force, Ukrainian Air Force, has been largely destroyed, it seems. They're not using many air assets at the moment for a number of reasons. One is that they have removed a lot of the threat. Secondly, as you mentioned, Ukrainians are using some missiles, so there is some concern. But that's a very target-rich environment, that 40-kilometer convoy. So if the Ukrainians had anything left, they'd have a go at it from the air. So to answer your question, it's a mixture of arrogance, political wishful thinking, infusing intelligence, as happened in Britain during the Iraq War, for example. So this is the problem of having a dictatorship who is not being contradicted. The Russians, as I observed myself firsthand in combat, can be very well organized indeed, especially Spetsnaz. But because they're having political direction from Putin, who seems to be in a somewhat deranged state of mind, this has been badly handled. But bear in mind, this is only just over a week. And to conquer a country in 2 weeks, especially if you look at when Ukraine was last conquered by the Germans, you need a fair amount of time. So the Russians are behaving and performing badly, running out of petrol maybe. I don't believe a lot of the Western propaganda about Russian troops crying, but the Russians are being sloppy.
Okay, gentlemen, now let's take a look at the bigger picture. I have this map with me here. David, now it appears Russia is very strong on the eastern front. On the north and south, it is struggling. Now, negotiations between the Russians and the Ukrainians have entered a second phase. My question is, David, are these negotiations a strategy by President Putin to buy some more time so that he can reinforce Russian forces in the north and south?
Well, if we look at past Russian performance, particularly in Syria, that's exactly how they did it. Negotiations were just to allow tactical regrouping, logistical resupport, and then in some instances removal of combatants from the battlefield. So that's a possibility. But I think that the Russians genuinely were surprised. You know, the Pentagon term is they drank their own bathwater. They really did believe that this would be a lightning offensive, that Ukraine would be like Crimea, where they had a relatively welcoming population and it was quick, easy, dirty. And once, if that plan doesn't work, then you're left with a lot of problems and a somewhat flawed logistical structure and what appears to be a very, very inflexible intelligence system. You know, the fact that they're able to launch missiles at fixed targets but not at moving targets indicates that their intelligence is just not capable of adapting to emerging threats. So there's a lot of problems. I think the negotiations are some breathing space, but I think that both sides, might be looking for a graceful way out.
Okay, whether or not the West and much of the world underestimated the Ukrainians or overestimated the Russians, we are going to discuss that in detail. Gustavo, Gustav, let me come to you. I'm still looking at the map here with me. Now it appears the eastern Donbas region, the regions of Luhansk and Donetsk, are in Russian control. Crimea is already in Russian control since 2014. We are hearing reports of active fighting in the cities of Mariupol, which is between the Donetsk and Crimea region. Do you think the Russians, by capturing this city, are planning to perhaps carve out a bridge that could connect Crimea with eastern Donbas region? Gustav?
Well, if we take Putin seriously, and I think we should, and listen to his speech last week, his large speech on sort of his historic vision on that, the war aim is to subjugate Ukraine, to destroy it as a nation, to exterminate its political, cultural, and intellectual elites. It's not about land bridges. It's not about Donbas. This is about the entire Ukraine. So far to the political aim. And now, of course, militarily, yes, the inroad from Crimea was so far the most successful front. They have made large progress. Mariupol is encircled. I have to be very honest. I sometimes struggle to really identify how sustainable the Russian advance is, because the rapid progress has been achieved by individual battalions, individual companies at some point, sort of taking, under quotation mark, a village or a town, basically appearing there and later on being expelled by the Ukrainians. Also, the Ukrainians seem to have led a smaller detachment bypass, on the other hand, going sort of after the big Russian formations. So there's a very confusing picture about the situation further north of Mariupol, and especially sort of between Dnipropetrovsk, Zaporizhia, and the Donbas, and who is where and how sustainable Russian progress at the time actually is. But yes, this front is the most volatile, and this is, I think, the most dangerous one for Ukraine right now, because Ukraine has the problem that there is more countries to defend than it has actual forces to do so. And by the day the Russian Air Force gains in strength and Ukrainian air defenses struggle, the inserting the Russian Air Force to interdict movements will be easier.
Now, picking up on the dangerous part, just how dangerous is this Russian convoy, which is supposedly making its way to Kiev? Paul, on Tuesday, there were satellite images which were released showing a 60-kilometer long Russian convoy making its way from Belarus to Kiev. Right before stepping into the studios today, I checked those satellite images again, and it seems they haven't moved much. What do you make of that, Paul?
I have no idea. I like to witness things on the ground, but what I hear is that there's a mixture of disorganization, congestion, petrol problems, food problems, because clearly there's it's an open target. It just shows a kind of confidence or arrogance or bad planning. Those troops are supposed to be encircling Kiev, and they're not. I just want to go back to what the previous speaker said. I agree with him. They're trying to destroy the whole of Ukraine. But meanwhile, you may as well get some operational advantages by making Ukraine landlocked. So they've almost done that. When they'll move into Odessa next. So they may as well block off the south, which they're doing. But in terms of I spent some time in Syria as well, and I had the privilege of spending time with the Ukrainian army. They're very, very determined people. But Russia has an advantage. They are going to win. They will use a Chechen style of destroying some of the towns. And perhaps, to be contrarian, perhaps we should want the Russians to win, despite the tragedy. Because if they start losing, then Vladimir Putin is going to raise the ante again and expect some trouble in terms of the Baltic states, where there are some towns with Russian-speaking majorities. So there's a paradox. We may wish him ill, and he seems deranged, and he's changed the whole nature of international affairs. But if he doesn't win, he will expand the war.
Okay, David, if President Putin's idea is to capture the whole of Ukraine, how much longer do you think the Ukrainian army can sustain this offensive? Let's be realistic for a second here. Now, Russia is a massive military might. Perhaps the only country which could match Russia's military power is your country, David, the United States. So tell me, what are your thoughts on this? For how much longer the Ukrainians can sustain Russian attacks?
Yeah, good question. So the United States could match Russia's military might in the United States or in Mexico or in Canada, but to do it in Europe would take a long time. We have to speak of two aspects of the Ukraine. First, we have the Ukrainian army as a group of formations, that can move along the field and conduct a mounted maneuver. And I think that if Russia is able to cut through the bottlenecks, bring their mass to bear, in spite of all their problems, quantity has a quality all its own. I think that initially, most people thought the Ukrainian army as a constituted unit would be done within a week. I think that that's probably looking more like a month or 2 months, particularly if Russia brings, its artillery to bear. Right now, they've been trying to conduct a mobile war of seizure, but if they shift, as Paul said, to a war of destruction, about a month. But then you'd have national resistance, a sort of partisan attacks on isolated units, and I think that that could go on indefinitely. Quite frankly, Ukraine could become a running sore on the Russian body politic. So I think it's a little misleading in this context where the population from the start has been mobilizing for national warfare to speak of the defeat of the Ukrainian army. It would just become a more of a partisan force and less of a maneuver force.
Okay, Gustav. Now, contrary to the expectations of some analysts, Kiev has still not fallen to the Russians. So, if this turns into a protracted war or perhaps guerrilla warfare, does Russia have the capacity and the capability to fight insurgency?
Well, yes, they have. And the problem is here that some of the estimations I see in the West on how much forces it takes and how durable it will be, unfortunately underestimate other instruments Russia will bring to bear, like mass terror and sort of preemptive terror, if I might call it, like sort of incarcerating, shooting entire parts of the society, because this is a totalitarian regime, and this is why the Ukrainians are so determined to fight, because they have seen what the consequences are in being governed by this regime in Belarus and in the DNR, LNR. But said that, this phase of the war, the brutal one, might, as my previous speaker said last month, and the guerrilla war and the Ukrainians are very creative and they're very determined. They might find the weak spots of whatever puppet regime the Russians try to install. And indeed, this will be a bloody affair, and it might be a very long affair. Hence, also and it is an affair that many Russians do not see as sort of in line with national security thinking or with the kind of national idea they're promoting. So this can backfire for the Russian leadership. I think if this gets bloody enough, we should think of Finland in 1939. Stalin was not a nice comrade and didn't regard human lives very highly. But after 40 days of trying to invade Finland, he concluded that this was just too embarrassing for Russia as a great power to continue this and have a settlement. So I think that, yes, of course, Russia can bring all its firepower into place and can have an enormously destructive, repressive regime trying to put down the Ukrainian resistance. I don't think that it's all lost yet. There still is a chance that Putin will seek a way out of this that preserves more of Ukraine's integrity than we have actually thought.
Okay, gentlemen, we are in the dying minutes of the program, but I do want to talk about what kind of lessons can we learn from history when it comes to the war between Russia and Ukraine. Paul, I was told by my producer that you have spent time in Afghanistan when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. Do you think the Russians are repeating the same mistakes that the ones they made in Afghanistan?
Well, that's one advantage of being an old codger. When I was a young man, I experienced a lot of Russian combat firsthand in Afghanistan. And the Russians did not, some of the villages I stayed in, they would come in, Spetsnaz would come in and destroy everybody. They're fighting with one arm behind their back now. And they had air power because I was there in the period 84, 86 when they didn't, when the resistance, the Mujahideen didn't have Stingers. But the Russians were extremely ruthless compared with what they're doing now in Ukraine, because there are cameras around, there are Western journalists, these are brother Slavs, and so on and so on. So it's a very different kind of war. But the Russians really struggled, and they hadn't prepared their home audience, which is exactly what Putin hasn't done now. He hasn't prepared his people for a long war. So I agree that the conventional phase will probably last a month or two. Then there will be a guerrilla war. Then what happens to the international brigades who come in? Then what happens to the Baltic states? This is going to be long and dangerous as October 62 and the missile crisis, in my view.
Okay, gentlemen, let me go to David. David, but please be very brief with your answer. This is a question which is on everyone's mind. I certainly do not want to sensationalize this discussion, but how likely is it for a nuclear war to come out of the crisis that is happening in Ukraine?
Unlikely. Unlikely. The United States has said we're not going to be militarily involved in Ukraine. The United States canceled a long-tested missile test that was scheduled for today because they didn't want it to be misinterpreted. So I think that, yeah, unlikely.
All right, gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us today here on The Newsmakers. And thank you for watching. You can follow us on Twitter @_Newsmakers, and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Jafar Hasnan. See you next time.